Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're really zeroing in on a tricky spot in criminal law. When can the state basically say, okay, you intended this felony so that counts as intent for murder?
Exactly. It's all about the felony murder rule, or FMR, and maybe more importantly, this thing called the merger rule that tries to limit it.
Right. And we're going to dig deep into a pretty intense case from Washington State, State v. Thompson. It really highlights what happens when a state rejects that limitation.
It does. It's a perfect example of the minority view. Our goal here is to see how intent for murder gets proven, or maybe, assumed, when the act causing death is the same act as the underlying felony.
So we'll break down the rules element by element, see how Washington applied them in Thompson, and really understand the real-world impact of going against the grain on merger.
Precisely. We'll define FMR, then explain the merger rule, why most courts use it, and then we'll model that deep element-focused analysis using Thompson.
Okay, let's start with the basics then. This felony murder rule. It often gets called a kind of legal shortcut, right? So when can a prosecutor actually charge second-degree murder without needing to show the person specifically planned or intended to kill?
Well, the FMR essentially lets the prosecution transfer the required mental state, the malice, from the felony the person was committing over to the killing itself.
Oh,
So the rule, particularly in Washington where Thompson happened, basically says killing someone, unless it's excused or justified, is second-degree murder if it happens while the person is committing, attempting, or running away from a felony other than the really serious ones listed for first-degree FMR.
so let me get this straight. If I intend to commit, say, a felony assault and the person dies because of that assault, the law just jumps to the conclusion I had the intent for murder.
That's pretty much the mechanism, yeah. The
Yeah.
FMR provides what's called a conclusive presumption of the intent needed for murder.
Conclusive way.
Yeah. The underlying idea is, look, if you're already doing something seriously wrong, a felony, you've shown a generally malicious state of mind. So if someone dies as a result, that original felonious intent is deemed sufficient to hold you responsible for murder. It takes away the need for the prosecutor to prove you specifically intended the death.
That sounds incredibly severe, almost like strict liability for causing a death during any felony. Seems like it could easily sweep up situations that aren't really murder in the way we normally think of it.
It can feel that way, absolutely, and that's exactly why most courts developed a way to limit it.
Okay, so what is that judicial limit? And why do our sources say Washington's position is so isolated?
That limit is the merger rule. It's the majority approach across the U.S. The merger rule says the underlying felony you're using for the FMR must be independent of the homicide itself.
Independent, meaning?
Meaning, if the felony, like an assault, is basically just the physical act that caused the death, if it's included, in fact, in the homicide, then the felony merges with the homicide.
Aye.
And if it merges, you can't use the FMR. The prosecution then has to prove actual intent for murder, or maybe argue for manslaughter instead.
That distinction seems crucial. Independence versus merger. What's the policy reason for demanding that separation? Why must the felony be separate?
It's mainly to prevent something called bootstrapping.
Bootstrapping.
Yeah, think about it. Without the merger rule, almost any assault with a deadly weapon that results in death would automatically become second-degree murder.
Right, because the assault is a felony.
Exactly. So lots of cases that really feel like manslaughter, where someone intended maybe serious injury but not death, would get automatically bootstrapped up to a murder conviction. The California Supreme quote we looked at said, without merger, the FMR gets stretched beyond any rational function. It messes up the whole structure of homicide law, blurring the line between murder and manslaughter that legislatures try to create.
So if the act causing the death is the felony, using it for FMR is like double counting the same wrongdoing. That's the bootstrapping.
Okay.
Okay. This really sets the stage for State v. Thompson. We need to walk through this case carefully to see what happens when merger is rejected. Let's analyze State v. Thompson. First, what are the legally dispositive facts?
Okay. The defendant, Linda Marie Thompson, shot and killed her husband, Wayland. The circumstances presented were pretty grim. Wayland had apparently been drinking heavily, using drugs, driving erratically, even threatened to kill people in the car. And crucially, he'd physically attacked Linda, hitting her repeatedly with his fists and even a wine bottle.
So she argued self-defense.
She did, yes. But the state charged her with second-degree felony murder, and the felony they used as the basis for that charge was assault in the second degree, the very act of shooting him.
And the jury didn't buy the self-defense claim.
Okay.
But even so, how does this become murder and not manslaughter? This is where the merger issue must really hit the fan. So what was the core legal issue before the court?
The precise legal question was, did the trial court get it right by convicting Mrs. Thompson of second-degree murder using the FMR, even though the underlying felony, that second-degree assault, was the exact same act that caused the death? Essentially, was the court correct to stick with Washington's rejection of the merger rule?
All right, what rule of law did the court actually apply? Can you state the full black-letter rule and break it down into its testable parts, its elements?
Sure. The court applied Washington's specific version of the second-degree felony murder rule. This was based on a key precedent, State v. Harris, from back in 1966. Analytically, this rule breaks it down into three main elements you have to prove. First, there has to be the killing of a human being. Second, that killing cannot be excusable or justifiable. And third, the killing has to occur while the person is committing or attempting to commit a felony, one that isn't already listed for first-degree felony murder.
Okay, three elements. To really grasp the court's logic, we need to see how they applied each piece. Let's start the elemental analysis. How did the court apply the first element, the killing of a human being?
Well, this one was pretty straightforward, factually. Waylon Thompson died. The evidence showed his death was the proximate result of the gunshot wounds from the pistol Linda Thompson fired. So, element one. Clearly met. No real dispute there.
Understood. Simple enough. Now, what about the second element? The killing is not excusable or justifiable. This seems much more complex, given her testimony about the abuse and claiming self-defense.
It definitely was the focus of the defense. She presented evidence of the attack, the cuts, the bruises. She apparently had teeth loosened that needed treatment, strong evidence suggesting she acted out of fear for her life. However, the jury is the finder of fact. And in this case, the jury heard all that evidence, but ultimately rejected her claim of self-defense.
So they decided her use of lethal force wasn't legally justifiable under the circumstances.
Correct. From the court's perspective, once the jury made that factual determination, the legal element that the killing was not justifiable was met.
Okay. And now for the element that really makes this case a standout, the reason we're discussing it, the third element. The killing occurs while the person is engaged in the commission of a felony, specifically focusing on the assault and that controversial merger rule.
Right. This element needs an underlying felony that hasn't merged into the homicide. And here's where Washington's stance is critical. Washington, based on that State v. Harris case, had explicitly rejected the merger doctrine years before.
So they just didn't apply it.
They didn't. The Thompson court reaffirmed that precedent. They held that even when the underlying felony, the second-degree assault, the shooting itself is inherent in the homicide, meaning it is the act that caused the death. That assault felony does not merge.
Wow. So the single act of shooting him serves double duty. It's the assault, and it supplies the intent for murder.
That is precisely Washington's non-merger approach in action. The court pointed out that the state legislature knew about the Harris decision rejecting merger and hadn't changed the law in the decades since. They took that legislative inaction as sort of reinforcing the Harris precedent.
So no need for an independent felony in Washington.
Correct. Therefore, the assault itself was legally sufficient to trigger the felony murder rule. So element 3 was met.
And after analyzing all three elements that way, what was the court's final conclusion?
The court affirmed the trial court's judgment. They upheld Linda Thompson's conviction for murder in the second degree. By sticking to the rejection of the merger rule, the court allowed the act of assault, the shooting, to legally substitute for proof of malice aforethought, the specific intent usually required for murder.
The impact of that is just huge. The dissent in Thompson, as you mentioned, argued this basically turns manslaughter into murder by definition if an assault causes death. If any felony assault works, what does that really mean for someone who clearly didn't intend to kill? Feels like it waters down what murder even means.
It definitely raises major questions, about due process. The dissent's point was stark. In non-merger states like Washington, the law effectively eliminates the need to prove that crucial element, the specific intent to kill or cause grievous harm. They argued there's no separate act or felonious intent to transfer over. The assault is the fatal act. It collapses two distinct concepts into one, leaning heavily towards strict liability.
Okay, let's crystallize this with a really visceral example. Something to drive home that bootstrapping concern the dissent had. Imagine, let's say, a bar fight. Two people are arguing, it escalates, and one person shoves the other hard. Just a shove. But the person shoved stumbles backward unexpectedly, trips over a chair leg, falls, hits their head just wrong on the concrete floor, and dies. Now, let's assume that initial hard shove qualifies as a felony assault in Washington. What's the charge under their non-merger rule?
That's a perfect and unfortunately plausible hypothetical. The shove is the felony assault. Under Washington's non-merger rule, that felony assault immediately provides the necessary intent for second-degree murder.
Even though the person only intended to shove.
Even so, the prosecution doesn't need to prove any intent to kill or even cause serious injury from the fall. The intent for the felony shove is enough. It's exactly the scenario the merger rule is designed to prevent an act that most would see as manslaughter, maybe even involuntary manslaughter, depending on the recklessness, gets automatically bootstrapped into murder simply because the underlying act was technically a felony assault.
That difference in legal doctrine merger versus non-merger is absolutely life-altering for a defendant. It's potentially the difference between, what, a few years for manslaughter versus decades, maybe life, for murder, all based on which state you're in.
It really is the whole ballgame sometimes. And because the stakes are so high, and this is such a common issue, you need a solid framework for analyzing these situations. For anyone listening who might face this on an exam or even in practice, here's a kind of diagnostic checklist for FMR cases involving a homicide.
Okay, give us the toolkit. How do we break it down systematically?
All right, 4 steps. First, identify the homicide. Simple start. Was a human being killed? That covers element 1.
Got it.
Second, examine justification. Was the killing legally excused or justified, like self-defense? If the answer is yes, well, the analysis stops there, no crime. If no, you move on. That covers element 2.
Okay.
Third, identify the underlying felony. UF. What other felony, besides the killing itself, was the defendant allegedly committing or attempting at the time?
The felony that might trigger FMR.
Exactly. And then, fourth, the crucial step. Apply the merger rule, but remember the jurisdictional split. This is where you need to know the law of the specific place.
Right. Majority versus minority.
Correct. So if you're in a majority rule jurisdiction, like California, for example, you ask, was the underlying felony an assault that was included, in fact, in the homicide? Is it the same act? If yes, the felony merges, FMR is off the table, and you have to analyze for regular murder intent or manslaughter.
And if you're in the minority?
If you're in a minority rule jurisdiction like Washington, the underlying felony does not merge, even if it's the assault inherent in the homicide. So if the prosecution proves that underlying felony happened during the killing, the FMR applies, and bam, it's likely a murder conviction. That satisfies element 3 under their framework.
So what really stands out from all this is just how profoundly a single court decision, like State v. Harris from decades ago in Washington, interpreting a statute, can shape outcomes today. It changes the entire burden of proof and turns what looks like manslaughter, even in a case with compelling circumstances like Linda Thompson's alleged abuse, into second-degree murder.
It absolutely does. It fundamentally shifts the focus away from asking, did this person intend the death, to asking, did this person intend the underlying felony? That's a huge conceptual leap in criminal liability.
It really forces you, the listener, to think critically about where we, as a society, draw the line. When is it fair to use this kind of strict liability shortcut? And when must we demand proof of specific conscious intent before branding an act and a person with the label of murder? The merger rule, where it exists, seems like a vital safeguard against potential overreach. Something to definitely keep in mind the next time a complex case hits the headlines.